The snow was still falling when I heard the pounding on my front door at 6:30 in the morning, aggressive enough that I thought someone must be dying or the house was on fire. I stumbled out of bed, pulled on my flannel robe, and made my way downstairs. Through the frosted glass panels beside the door, I could make out a figure bundled in what looked like a designer winter coat, gesticulating wildly. Even before I opened the door, I had a sinking feeling I knew who it was. "You have any idea what time it is?" I asked as I pulled open the door, letting in a blast of frigid February air. Patricia Hawthorne stood on my porch, her face already red with indignation beneath her fur-lined hood. She was the president of our homeowners association here in Rockford Springs, Vermont, and she'd made it her personal mission to make everyone's life miserable since she'd moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago. "Aaron Jenkins, I need to speak with you immediately," she announced, pushing past me into my entryway without waiting for an invitation. "This is an emergency." I closed the door and followed her into my living room, where she was already pacing back and forth on my hardwood floors, leaving wet tracks from her expensive snow boots. "What's the emergency, Patricia?" "The snow," she said, turning to face me with her hands on her hips. "Look at this mess out there. It's been snowing for 2 days straight, and there are drifts everywhere. Some of us have important places to be." I glanced out my front window at the winter wonderland beyond. It was true that we'd gotten hit with a significant storm, probably 18 inches so far with more still coming down. But that was Vermont in February. This was hardly unusual. "Okay," I said slowly. "And what exactly do you want me to do about it?" Patricia's eyes narrowed. "I've seen that tractor of yours. The big red one with the plow attachment. I need you to clear out my driveway immediately, and then I need you to handle the common areas of the neighborhood. The HOA will consider this your contribution to the community." I blinked at her, wondering if she was serious. "Patricia, the town plow crews are working around the clock. They'll get to the neighborhood streets eventually. As for your driveway, you can hire a snow removal service like everyone else." "I shouldn't have to pay for something when you have the equipment right here," she snapped. "This is about being a good neighbor, Aaron. Besides, as HOA president, I'm making this an official request. Actually, no, I'm making it a requirement. It's your civic duty." I felt my jaw clench. I'd dealt with Patricia's nonsense before. She'd sent me violation notices about my lawn being a 1/4 inch too long, about my mailbox being the wrong shade of black, about my trash cans being visible from the street for 5 minutes longer than the HOA bylaws allowed. But this was a new level of entitlement. "Patricia, my tractor is my personal property. I'm not required to use it for the HOA, and I'm certainly not plowing your driveway for free at 6:30 in the morning." Her face flushed darker. "I could write you up for non-compliance with community standards." "For what, exactly? Not being your personal snow removal service." "For being an uncooperative neighbor," she said primly. "The HOA has standards about residents contributing to the community welfare." I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head. What Patricia didn't know, what I'd never bothered to mention in our previous encounters, was that I wasn't just some random guy with a tractor. I was the town zoning director for Rockford Springs, a position I'd held for the past 8 years. I'd kept it quiet in the neighborhood because I preferred to keep my work life and home life separate, and because I'd learned that people treated you differently when they knew you had authority over land use and building permits. "Patricia, I'm going to say this one more time. I'm not plowing your driveway. I'm not plowing the neighborhood common areas. That's not my responsibility. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish my coffee and get ready for work." She stared at me for a long moment, her mouth pressed into a thin line. "Fine, but you'll regret this, Aaron. The HOA board meets tonight, and we'll be discussing your lack of community spirit. I'm sure we can find several violations to write you up for. Maybe it's time we reviewed whether someone like you is really a good fit for our neighborhood." Before I could respond, she turned on her heel and marched toward my front door, yanking it open and letting in another blast of cold air before slamming it behind her hard enough to rattle the windows. I stood there for a moment, shaking my head. Then I went to the kitchen and poured myself a very large cup of coffee. The thing was, I actually did use my tractor to help out neighbors occasionally. Mrs. Chen, 3 doors down, was elderly and living on a fixed income, so I cleared her driveway whenever it snowed. The Martins had a new baby and were overwhelmed, so I'd helped them out a few times too. But I did it because I wanted to help, not because some self-appointed neighborhood dictator demanded it. I got dressed and headed out to my truck around 7:30. The snow had finally stopped, leaving everything buried under nearly 2 feet of fresh powder. My truck had 4-wheel drive, so I wasn't too worried about getting to the office, but I could see that the neighborhood streets were still unplowed. As I drove past Patricia's house, I couldn't help but notice her standing in her front window, watching me go by. Her Mercedes was completely buried in her driveway, and I felt a small, petty satisfaction that she was stuck at home. The drive to the town offices took twice as long as usual, but I made it. The building was a converted Victorian house on Main Street, and my office was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the town square. My assistant, Margaret, was already there when I arrived, looking harried. "Morning, boss," she said, looking up from her computer. "We've got problems." "What kind of problems?" "The Riverside Development Project. The HOA for Riverside Estates is claiming that the new commercial zone you approved last month violates some kind of community covenant. They've filed a formal complaint with the town council." I felt a headache starting behind my eyes. "Let me guess. Patricia Hawthorne." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "How did you know? She's the HOA president for my neighborhood too." "She was at my house this morning demanding I use my personal tractor to plow her driveway." "You're kidding." I wish I was. I hung up my coat and sat down at my desk, pulling up the complaint on my computer. Sure enough, there was Patricia's name at the top of the document, along with several other HOA board members from around town. It looked like she'd been busy building a coalition. The complaint was the usual NIMBY nonsense, claiming that commercial development near residential areas would decrease property values, increase traffic, and destroy the character of the neighborhood. The problem was, the zoning change I'd approved was completely legal and had gone through all the proper channels. We'd held public hearings, reviewed environmental impact studies, and consulted with the town planning board. Everything was by the book. But that didn't mean Patricia couldn't make my life difficult. She was clearly good at rallying people to her cause, and the town council could be swayed by loud, persistent complaints from voters. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing the files and preparing a detailed response to the complaint. Around noon, my phone rang. It was Mayor Roberts. "Aaron, we need to talk about this HOA situation," he said without preamble. "I figured you'd be calling. Patricia Hawthorne has been blowing up my phone all morning. She's claiming you're retaliating against her because of some personal dispute." I sat back in my chair. "Is that what she's saying?" "She says you refuse to provide snow removal services to the community, and that you're now trying to push through commercial development to spite the HOA. Tom, that's complete nonsense. First of all, she showed up at my house at 6:30 this morning demanding I use my personal equipment to plow her driveway for free. When I said no, she threatened to write me up for HOA violations. Second, the Riverside Development Project was approved a month ago after a thorough review process. This has nothing to do with any personal dispute. There was a pause on the other end of the line. She showed up at your house at 6:30 in the morning, uninvited, and demanded I be her personal snow removal service. Then she threatened me when I refused. Mayor Roberts sighed. Aaron, you know I trust your judgment, but we've got a situation here. Patricia has gotten 3 other HOA presidents to sign onto this complaint, and they're threatening to pack the next council meeting with residents. They're calling it government overreach and saying you're not responsive to community concerns. The community concerns were addressed during the public comment period. We had 2 hearings and exactly 3 people showed up. Now suddenly it's a problem. I know. But you know how this works. A vocal minority can cause a lot of headaches. Just be prepared for some pushback. After I hung up, I sat staring at my computer screen for a long moment. Patricia was clearly escalating things, and she was doing it strategically. She knew that dragging my professional decisions into question could cause me real problems, even if her complaints were baseless. Margaret appeared in my doorway. Everything okay? Patricia Hawthorne is trying to make my life hell. What are you going to do? My job, I said. And I'm going to do it exactly by the book, so she can't claim I'm doing anything improper. The rest of the day was busy with routine matters. I reviewed several permit applications, consulted with the town engineer about a drainage issue on the east side of town, and had a meeting with a developer who wanted to convert an old mill building into apartments. Normal stuff. I headed home around 5:30, grateful that the town plows had finally made it through the neighborhood. My street was clear, though most driveways were still buried. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a bright orange piece of paper stuck to my front door. My stomach sank even before I got close enough to read it. It was an HOA violation notice. I pulled it off the door and read through it. According to Patricia, I was in violation of 3 separate HOA covenants. First, my trash cans had been visible from the street for longer than the allowed time period. Second, my lawn decorations, a single garden gnome that had been there for 5 years, were not approved. Third, my vehicle, presumably my work truck, was parked in my driveway in a manner that was deemed unsightly. Each violation came with a $50 fine. I crumpled the paper in my fist and went inside. This was harassment, pure and simple. Patricia was retaliating against me for not plowing her driveway, and she was using the HOA rules as a weapon. I made myself dinner and tried to relax, but I kept thinking about the situation. The HOA meeting was tonight at 7, which Patricia had mentioned that morning. I hadn't planned on attending, but now I was reconsidering. Maybe it was time to face this head-on. At 6:45, I walked down the street to the community center where the HOA meetings were held. It was a small building at the entrance to the neighborhood, paid for by HOA dues and used for various community functions. When I walked in, Patricia was already there, sitting at a table at the front of the room with 3 other board members. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw me, but she quickly recovered, arranging her features into a cold smile. "Aaron, how nice of you to join us," she said. "We weren't expecting you." I figured I should attend, given that I'm apparently on the agenda. About a dozen other residents were scattered around the room in folding chairs. Most of them I recognized by sight, though I didn't know many of them well. I took a seat near the back and waited. Patricia called the meeting to order and went through the usual routine business. Minutes from the last meeting, treasurer's report, discussion of landscaping for the common areas. Then she got to what she clearly considered the main event. Item 7 on the agenda, she announced. Community participation and the issue of residents who fail to contribute to neighborhood welfare. She launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about community values and how everyone needed to do their part. She talked about neighbors helping neighbors and how some people seem to think they were above pitching in. We have residents in this neighborhood who have resources that could benefit everyone, she said, her eyes flicking toward me. Resources like snow removal equipment. But instead of offering to help their neighbors, they refused to be team players. They put their own convenience above the needs of the community. One of the other board members, a man named Douglas Pembroke, nodded along. It's a real shame when people are so selfish. I raised my hand. Patricia looked annoyed but called on me. I just want to clarify something, I said, standing up. Are you talking about me? Patricia's smile was saccharine. If the shoe fits, Aaron. Then let me be very clear about the facts. You came to my house at 6:30 this morning, uninvited, and demanded that I use my personal property to provide you with free snow removal services. When I declined, you threatened me with HOA violations. That's not about community participation. That's about you expecting special treatment. A murmur went through the room. Patricia's face flushed. That's a complete mischaracterization of what happened. Is it? Because I'm happy to describe the encounter in detail for everyone here. The point is, Patricia said loudly, talking over me, that we have community standards in this neighborhood. And if you can't meet those standards, perhaps you need to reconsider whether you belong here. Are you threatening to try to force me out of my home because I wouldn't plow your driveway? I'm saying that the HOA has rules, and we expect everyone to follow them, including you. She held up several pieces of paper. In fact, we've documented multiple violations of HOA covenants at your property. Continued violations could result in fines, liens, and ultimately legal action. This was getting out of hand quickly. I took a breath and decided it was time to play a card I'd been holding. Patricia, I think you should be very careful about threatening legal action, especially since I'm fairly certain that the HOA doesn't actually have the authority you think it does. She frowned. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I've reviewed the HOA covenants and bylaws quite carefully. I'm the town zoning director, and part of my job is understanding property law and land use restrictions. The room went very quiet. Patricia's mouth opened slightly. You're what? She asked. I'm the town zoning director for Rockford Springs. I have been for 8 years, and in reviewing the HOA documents, I've noticed some interesting things. For example, did you know that several of the rules you've been enforcing aren't actually in the recorded covenants? They're in supplementary bylaws that were never properly approved by the membership vote as required by state law. Patricia's face had gone from red to pale. That's not true. It is true. I pulled the recorded documents from the county clerk's office. The covenants that were recorded when this subdivision was created are much more limited than the rules you've been enforcing. Things like lawn decoration restrictions, not in the original covenants. Restrictions on what time trash cans can be visible, not in the original covenants. Most of the violations you've been citing people for aren't actually enforceable. Douglas Pembroke leaned over and whispered something to Patricia. She waved him off, her jaw clenched. Furthermore, I continued, there's the matter of how HOA funds are being spent. As a municipal official, I'm familiar with the requirements for nonprofit organizations. Has this HOA been filing the required annual reports with the state? Because I couldn't find any record of them. This is harassment, Patricia sputtered. You're abusing your position to retaliate against the HOA. I'm not retaliating against anyone. I'm pointing out that if you're going to threaten me with legal action, you should make sure your own house is in order first. Because, from what I can see, this HOA has been operating outside its legal authority for quite some time. An older woman in the front row raised her hand tentatively. Are you saying the fines we've been paying aren't legitimate? I'm saying that many of the rules being enforced don't appear to be in the legally binding covenants, which means the fines for violating those rules are questionable at best. The murmuring in the room grew louder. People were pulling out their phones, presumably looking up the covenants themselves. Patricia stood up, gathering her papers. "This meeting is adjourned," she announced. "You can't just adjourn the meeting," Douglas protested. "We haven't finished the agenda." "I said we're done," Patricia snapped. She grabbed her coat and purse and headed for the door. I stayed for a few more minutes, answering questions from other residents. Several people were clearly angry about fines they'd paid, and others wanted to know how they could access the official recorded covenants. I gave them the information about the county clerk's office and suggested they might want to consult with an attorney if they'd paid substantial fines. When I finally headed home, I felt simultaneously satisfied and uneasy. I'd made my point, but I'd also made a powerful enemy. Patricia wasn't the type to back down gracefully. The next morning proved me right. When I got to the office, Margaret met me with a worried expression. "We've got a problem. Patricia Hawthorne filed a formal ethics complaint against you with the state." "On what grounds?" "She's claiming you used your position as zoning director to intimidate and threaten private citizens, and that you're abusing your authority to retaliate against the HOA." I sat down heavily in my chair. An ethics complaint was serious. Even if it was ultimately dismissed, it would require an investigation, and it would be a matter of public record. It could damage my reputation and my career. "She also filed a complaint with the town council," Margaret continued. "She's demanding your resignation." "Of course she is." I spent the morning consulting with the town attorney, a sharp woman named Linda Vasquez. She reviewed the situation and shook her head. "This is clearly retaliatory," she said. "But you're still going to have to respond to the ethics complaint formally. The state board will investigate, and it'll take time." "How much time?" "Could be months. In the meantime, I'd recommend you be very careful about any interactions with Miss Hawthorne or the HOA. Don't give her any ammunition." "I wasn't planning to." "Also," Linda said, looking at her notes, "were you serious about the HOA operating outside its authority?" "Completely. I reviewed the recorded covenants. Most of what they've been enforcing isn't in there." Linda leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "That's potentially a big problem for them. If they've been collecting fines for rules that aren't legally enforceable, they could be facing serious liability. People could sue to get their money back." "That's not my problem." "No, but it might become relevant. If Patricia is facing her own legal troubles, she might be more motivated to drop this vendetta against you." Over the next few days, things escalated further. Patricia apparently spent her time contacting every HOA in Rockford Springs, trying to build a coalition against me. She claimed I was anti-HOA and was using my position to undermine property owners' rights to self-governance. It might have worked, except that several residents from my neighborhood started telling their friends and neighbors in other HOAs about what I'd revealed at the meeting. Word spread quickly that Patricia's HOA had been enforcing rules that weren't actually in the covenants, and that they'd collected thousands of dollars in questionable fines. A local reporter for the Rockford Springs Gazette got wind of the story and called me for a comment. I politely declined, referring her to the town attorney's office. But I did confirm that the HOA covenants were public records available at the county clerk's office. The resulting article was published 3 days later, and it was not kind to Patricia. The reporter had done her homework, interviewing multiple residents who'd paid fines over the years. One couple had paid over $2,000 for various violations, including having the wrong color mailbox and letting their grass grow too high. When shown the actual recorded covenants, which didn't mention mailboxes or grass height, they were understandably furious. The article also noted that the HOA's financial records were murky at best, with no clear accounting of where all the collected fines had gone. The HOA was supposed to use the money for common area maintenance, but several residents complained that the landscaping was minimal and the community center was in disrepair. Within 24 hours, Patricia was facing a different kind of problem. A class action lawsuit was filed by a group of residents seeking return of all fines paid over the past 3 years, plus damages. The lawsuit alleged fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I got home from work one evening to find that my mailbox had been vandalized. Someone had spray-painted "Tyrant" across it in red letters. My garden gnome had been smashed to pieces, and all 4 of my truck's tires had been slashed. I called the police and filed a report. The responding officer, a young guy named Matthews, looked at the damage and shook his head. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked. "I have suspicions, but no proof." "This connected to that HOA situation I read about in the paper, probably." He made notes and took some photos. "We'll increase patrols in the area. You might want to consider installing some security cameras." I took his advice and spent the next day installing a comprehensive camera system around my property. Front door, back door, driveway, and one covering the street. If Patricia or one of her allies came back, I'd have evidence this time. The cameras proved to be a good investment. 2 nights later, around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I pulled up the camera app and watched as a figure in dark clothing crept up my driveway. They were carrying something that looked like a can of spray paint. I immediately called 911 and grabbed my own phone to record video. The dispatcher said officers were on the way. On the camera feed, I watched the figure approach my truck and raise the spray paint can. Before they could make the first mark, a police cruiser pulled onto my street with its lights flashing. The figure dropped the spray paint and ran, but the officer was faster. He caught up with them at the end of my driveway and tackled them to the ground. I went outside just as the officer was putting handcuffs on the perpetrator. When he pulled back their hood, I wasn't entirely surprised to see Douglas Pembroke, Patricia's fellow HOA board member. "That's him," I told the officer. "My cameras caught the whole thing." Douglas was sputtering protests about how I'd ruined the neighborhood and destroyed property values. The officer wasn't interested in his excuses. "You're under arrest for attempted vandalism and trespassing," the officer said, reading Douglas his rights. A second police car arrived, and I provided copies of the camera footage showing Douglas approaching with clear intent to vandalize my property. I also mentioned the previous vandalism and my suspicions that it might have been him or someone associated with the HOA board. Douglas was taken away, and I gave a full statement to the police. The officer told me that depending on the evidence and Douglas's record, he could be facing misdemeanor charges at minimum. The next morning, the story was all over the neighborhood Facebook group. Patricia tried to do damage control, posting a statement saying that Douglas had acted alone and didn't represent the HOA board. But the comments section lit up with residents expressing anger and disgust at the board's behavior. Several people pointed out that Patricia herself had been making increasingly unhinged posts about me over the past week, calling me corrupt and claiming I was part of a conspiracy to destroy HOA rights. While she hadn't explicitly called for vandalism, she'd certainly created an atmosphere that encouraged it. Mayor Roberts called me later that day. "Aaron, I heard about the arrest. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Just glad I installed those cameras. This situation is getting out of hand." The town council is worried about the liability implications. If an HOA board member is targeting a town employee, that's a serious problem. "What do you want me to do about it?" "Nothing. Keep doing your job, but I want you to know that the council is backing you 100%. We reviewed the ethics complaint Patricia filed, and it's baseless. We're prepared to issue a statement supporting you if necessary." "I appreciate that, Tom. Also, between you and me, the State Attorney General's office has apparently taken an interest in this HOA situation. When there are allegations of fraud and a pattern of collecting money under false pretenses, that can rise to the level of criminal charges." I felt a chill run through me. Criminal charges. If Patricia and the board have been knowingly enforcing fake rules and pocketing thousands of dollars in fines, that's potentially theft by deception. The AG's office is reviewing the complaint and the news reports. They may open an investigation. After we hung up, I sat at my desk thinking about how rapidly the situation had spiraled. All because Patricia had demanded I plow her driveway and I'd said no. The following week brought more developments. Douglas Pembroke was formally charged with attempted vandalism and trespassing. He immediately tried to cut a deal, offering to provide information about the HOA board's activities in exchange for reduced charges. What he revealed was worse than anyone had suspected. According to Douglas, Patricia had been systematically creating fake violations and issuing fines for years. She'd kept 2 sets of books for the HOA, one showing minimal fine collection and one showing the real amounts. The difference, more than $50,000 over 3 years, had been deposited into a personal account that Patricia controlled. The other board members, including Douglas, had received small kickbacks to stay quiet and support her enforcement actions. It was an organized scheme to defraud the homeowners. The State Attorney General's office moved quickly once they had this information. 2 investigators showed up at Patricia's house with a warrant, seizing financial records and computers. Patricia was arrested and charged with multiple counts of theft by deception, fraud, and racketeering. The local news covered her arrest extensively. The image of Patricia being led out of her house in handcuffs, her face a mask of fury and humiliation, was broadcast on every channel. The reporter who'd written the original article did a follow-up piece detailing the scope of the fraud and the investigation. As for me, the ethics complaint against me was quickly dismissed once the full scope of Patricia's activities came to light. The state board issued a statement saying there was no evidence I'd abused my position, and that I'd actually been acting appropriately in pointing out that the HOA was operating outside its legal authority. The town council also issued a statement expressing full confidence in my work as zoning director. Mayor Roberts went further, praising me for maintaining professional standards even in the face of harassment and intimidation. The neighborhood, meanwhile, was in chaos. With Patricia and Douglas facing criminal charges, the HOA board had effectively collapsed. The remaining members resigned, and the homeowners called an emergency meeting to figure out what to do. I attended that meeting, along with about 50 other residents. The mood was somber and angry. People had lost money to Patricia's scheme, and they wanted answers. A woman named Susan Martinez stood up and addressed the crowd. "We need to start over. The entire HOA structure needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, with proper oversight and accountability." There was general agreement. Someone suggested hiring a professional HOA management company to handle the finances and ensure everything was above board. Someone else proposed requiring regular audits and making all financial records available to any homeowner who requested them. I raised my hand and was called on. "I want to apologize to all of you for not bringing this to light sooner. I noticed the problems with the covenants a while ago but didn't say anything because I try to keep my work and home life separate. If I'd spoken up earlier, maybe some of this could have been prevented." Susan shook her head. "Aaron, this isn't your fault. You tried to warn us. Patricia is the one who chose to run a criminal enterprise." The meeting went on for 2 more hours, with residents working together to create a plan for restructuring the HOA. They voted to suspend all fine collection until new, properly approved bylaws could be drafted. They also voted to hire a lawyer to review all the existing covenants and ensure they were legally sound. Most importantly, they voted to elect an interim board with strict term limits and requirements for financial transparency. Susan was elected as interim president, and she immediately promised that the new board would operate completely differently from Patricia's regime. As the meeting broke up, several neighbors came over to shake my hand and thank me. Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor whose driveway I'd been plowing, patted my arm. "You're a good man, Aaron. You stood up to a bully, and you did the right thing even when it cost you." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. But honestly, I just didn't want to plow Patricia's driveway at 6:30 in the morning." She laughed. "Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance lead to the biggest changes." Over the next few months, Patricia's case worked its way through the legal system. She was facing serious charges, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. Douglas and another former board member agreed to testify against her in exchange for reduced charges. The civil lawsuit filed by the homeowners also moved forward. Patricia's assets were frozen, including her house and bank accounts. It looked like she was going to lose everything. I tried not to take too much satisfaction in her downfall, but it was hard not to feel vindicated. She tried to destroy my career and reputation because I wouldn't bend to her demands, and instead, her own criminal behavior had been exposed. In May, Patricia accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to multiple counts of theft by deception and fraud, and was sentenced to 3 years in prison followed by 5 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the homeowners she'd defrauded, though given that she was losing her house and most of her assets in the civil lawsuit, it was unclear how much money the homeowners would actually recover. Douglas received a sentence of 1 year in jail and 3 years of probation for his role in the scheme, as well as for the vandalism of my property. The other board member who'd taken kickbacks received probation and community service. The Rockford Springs Gazette did a final article summarizing the case, calling it a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power in homeowner associations. The reporter interviewed me for the piece, and I emphasized the importance of homeowners knowing their rights and actually reading their HOA covenants. "A lot of people just assume that the HOA board has the authority to make any rules they want," I said in the interview. "But that's not how it works. The covenants are legal documents that define what the HOA can and can't do. If your board is enforcing rules that aren't in the covenants, you have every right to challenge them." The article also noted that several other HOAs in the region had conducted reviews of their own operations in the wake of Patricia's case, and a few had discovered similar, if less egregious, problems with improper rule enforcement. As summer arrived, the neighborhood finally settled into a new normal. The reconstituted HOA board under Susan's leadership was operating smoothly, with regular meetings, transparent finances, and a focus on actual community improvement rather than nitpicking violations. They used some of the HOA funds to make real improvements to the common areas. New playground equipment, better landscaping, and repairs to the community center. They also organized actual community events like summer barbecues and movie nights in the park, which did more to build neighborhood spirit than any amount of rule enforcement ever had. As for me, I continued my work as zoning director, handling the usual mix of permit applications, zoning disputes, and development proposals. The Riverside development project that Patricia had tried to block moved forward successfully, bringing new retail and office space to an underutilized part of town. I also took on a new role as an informal advisor to the HOA board, helping them navigate the legal complexities of covenant enforcement and land use issues. I didn't charge for my time, because I genuinely wanted to help make sure the neighborhood operated properly this time around. One evening in late June, I was out in my driveway washing my truck when Susan walked over from her house down the street. "Hey, Aaron, got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" she smiled. "I just wanted to thank you again for everything you did." I know it wasn't easy standing up to Patricia, especially with her going after your job. I didn't really have a choice. She wasn't going to stop. Maybe not, but a lot of people would have just kept their heads down and tried to avoid trouble. You didn't. She paused. Also, I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to serve on a committee we're forming. We're working on drafting new bylaws for the HOA, and we could really use someone with your expertise. I'd be happy to help. Great. Oh, and one more thing. Her smile widened. We're planning a big neighborhood block party in August. We're going to need someone with a tractor to help set up. Know anyone who might be willing to volunteer? I laughed. I think I might know a guy. The block party in August was the biggest neighborhood event in years. Nearly every household participated, with tables of food lining the street and kids running around playing games. Someone set up a bounce house. Someone else brought a karaoke machine, and the whole street was closed off for the afternoon. I used my tractor to help set up, hauling tables and equipment and clearing space for the various activities. Several neighbors commented on it, making jokes about HOA presidents demanding tractor services. It had become a neighborhood legend, the story of how Patricia's overreach had led to her downfall. As the sun set and the party wound down, I found myself sitting in a lawn chair with a group of neighbors, watching kids chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Mrs. Chen was there, along with Susan, the Martins with their now toddler son, and several others. "You know," said Tom Martin, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually glad Patricia showed up at your door that morning demanding you plow her driveway." Everyone looked at him in surprise. "Hear me out," he continued. "If she hadn't pushed you too far, if you hadn't pushed back, we might never have found out what she was doing. She could have kept that scam going for years, taking more and more money from all of us. In a weird way, her trying to bully you was the best thing that could have happened to this neighborhood." Susan nodded thoughtfully. "He's right. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal problems that have been there all along." Patricia's behavior was a symptom of a broken system, and now we have a chance to build something better. "Here's to building something better," I said, raising my beer. Everyone clinked their drinks together, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while, enjoying the warm evening and the sound of children's laughter. Later, as I walked back to my house, I thought about how much had changed in just a few months. I'd gone from being a guy who mostly kept to himself to being an active part of the community. The neighborhood had gone from being ruled by fear and petty tyranny to being a place where people actually wanted to spend time together. And all because I'd said no to plowing a driveway. Inside my house, I poured myself a whiskey and sat on my back deck, looking out at the summer night. My phone buzzed with a text from Mayor Roberts. Saw the article about your neighborhood block party. Looks like you all are doing well. Good job standing your ground. The town is better for it. I texted back my thanks and put the phone away. Tomorrow I'd be back at work, reviewing permit applications and dealing with the usual zoning issues. But tonight, I just wanted to enjoy the peace and quiet. As I sat there, I heard a sound from the front of the house. I walked around to investigate and found Susan standing by my mailbox, which I'd replaced after the vandalism. "Sorry, didn't mean to disturb you," she said. "I was just dropping off the meeting notes from the bylaw committee. Figured you'd want to review them before our next session. Thanks." "You didn't have to bring them by tonight." "I know, but I was walking past anyway." She hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When Patricia first showed up that morning when she demanded you plow her driveway, did you have any idea it would turn into all this?" I thought about it. "No. Honestly, I just thought she was being her usual entitled self. I figured she'd write me up for some bogus violation and I'd ignore it like I always did. But when she threatened you, when she tried to use the HOA as a weapon, you decided to fight back. I decided I was done being pushed around. There's a difference between being a good neighbor and being a doormat. Patricia never learned that." Susan nodded. "That's what we're trying to build now. A community where people help each other because they want to, not because someone's threatening them with fines. A place where the rules make sense and everyone has a voice." "Sounds good to me." She smiled and headed back down the street. I went back inside, feeling satisfied with how things had turned out. The rest of the summer passed peacefully. I continued my work at the town office, helped the HOA committee draft sensible bylaws, and enjoyed actually being part of a functional neighborhood community. The new bylaws were approved by a vote of the membership in September, and they were a model of clarity and reasonableness. The rules focused on genuine community concerns like property maintenance and noise, not petty nonsense about trash, visibility, or lawn decorations. In October, I got a letter from the State Attorney General's office thanking me for my role in exposing the HOA fraud case. They noted that the case had led to a broader review of HOA operations across the state, and new legislation was being proposed to increase oversight and transparency requirements. The letter ended with a line that made me smile. "Sometimes standing up for what's right starts with saying no to an unreasonable demand. Thank you for your integrity and courage." I framed that letter and hung it in my office, not out of ego, but as a reminder. A reminder that small acts of resistance matter. That standing your ground against bullies is important, even when it's inconvenient or scary. That sometimes the right thing to do is simply to say no. Winter came around again, and with it, the first major snowstorm of the season. I woke up to find 18 inches of fresh powder covering everything, just like the previous year. This time, though, no one came pounding on my door demanding I plow their driveway. Instead, I fired up my tractor and headed out to clear Mrs. Chen's driveway, like I always did. Then I did the Martin's place, and the elderly couple 3 streets over who'd just gotten out of the hospital. When I was done, I found that several other neighbors had been out with their snowblowers, clearing sidewalks and helping each other dig out. Someone had left a thermos of hot coffee on my porch with a note that said, "Thanks for being a good neighbor." That's what community was supposed to be. Not rules and fines and threats, but people helping each other because it was the right thing to do. I sat in my kitchen drinking that coffee, warm and content, and thought about Patricia sitting in a prison cell somewhere. I wondered if she'd learned anything from what had happened, if she understood that her downfall had come not from my resistance, but from her own choices. Probably not. People like Patricia rarely accepted responsibility for their actions. She probably still saw herself as the victim, unfairly targeted for trying to maintain standards. But that didn't matter anymore. She was gone, and the neighborhood was better for it. The community was thriving under new leadership that understood the difference between governance and tyranny. As for me, I'd learned some things too. I'd learned that sometimes keeping your head down and avoiding conflict isn't the answer. That there are times when you have to stand up and push back, even if it's uncomfortable. That your principles mean nothing if you're not willing to defend them. I'd also learned that I liked being part of a community, being more than just a guy who went to work and came home. The neighborhood felt like home now in a way it never had before. My phone buzzed with a text from Susan. HOA meeting tonight at 7. We're discussing the winter maintenance budget. Hope you can make it. I texted back that I'd be there. Because that's what you do when you're part of a community. You show up. You participate. You help build something better. And if someone shows up at your door at 6:30 in the morning demanding you plow their driveway, well, you politely tell them no, and you stand by that decision no matter what comes next. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance lead to the biggest changes. Mrs. Chen had been right about that. I finished my coffee, pulled on my boots, and headed back out into the snow. There was more work to do, more driveways to clear for neighbors who needed help. Not because anyone demanded it, not because of HOA rules or threats or obligations, but because that's what good neighbors do. And because this time, I was doing it on my own terms, in a community that had learned the difference between cooperation and coercion. The snow kept falling, soft and steady, blanketing everything in white. I climbed onto my tractor, fired up the engine, and got to work. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of perfect winter day that made you glad to be alive and part of something bigger than yourself. In the distance, I could see other neighbors coming out to clear their walks, to help each other, to build the kind of community we all deserved. The kind of community that Patricia's iron fist had prevented for so long. It had taken a confrontation, a scandal, and criminal charges to get here. But we'd made it. We'd torn down the old broken system and built something better in its place, and it had all started with a simple word: no. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. One person willing to draw a line and say this far and no further. One person willing to stand up to a bully and refuse to be intimidated. I thought about all the people over the years who'd paid Patricia's bogus fines, who'd been harassed and threatened, who'd suffered under her petty tyranny because they didn't know they had the right to say no. I was glad that chapter was over, glad that the next generation of homeowners in this neighborhood would grow up in a place where community meant support, not surveillance. The tractor rumbled beneath me as I cleared another driveway, the plow blade scraping against the asphalt, pushing the heavy snow aside. It was hard work, but satisfying. The kind of work that made a real difference in people's lives. When I finally finished and headed home, the sun was high in the sky and the neighborhood looked beautiful. All the driveways and walks cleared, smoke rising from chimneys, kids already out building snowmen in their yards. This was what I'd been fighting for, though I hadn't quite realized it at the time. Not just the right to refuse an unreasonable demand, but the right to live in a community based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than fear and control. I parked my tractor in the garage and went inside to warm up. As I made myself lunch, I looked out the window at the neighborhood and smiled. We'd been through a lot, but we'd come out stronger on the other side, and if another HOA tyrant ever tried to take control, well, now everyone knew what to look for. They knew their rights, knew the warning signs, knew that they had the power to say no. That was the real victory. Not Patricia's arrest or the recovery of the stolen money, but the knowledge that had spread through the community. The understanding that HOA boards served the homeowners, not the other way around. My phone rang. It was Mayor Roberts again. "Aaron, got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" "I'm calling to give you some good news. The town council voted last night to give you a commendation for your handling of the HOA situation. We're holding a ceremony next month to recognize your integrity and your service to the community." I felt myself flush with embarrassment. "Tom, that's really not necessary." "Yes, it is. What you did took courage, and it made a real difference. Not just in your neighborhood, but across the whole region. Those new HOA transparency laws that are being proposed, they're calling them the Rockford Springs reforms, and it's all because you stood up to corruption and fraud." "I just didn't want to plow someone's driveway." Tom laughed. "Sometimes that's how it starts, but you saw it through and you never compromised your principles. That deserves recognition." After we hung up, I sat down heavily on my couch, feeling overwhelmed. I'd never set out to be any kind of hero or reformer. I just wanted to live my life, do my job, and be left alone. But sometimes circumstances force you into a role you never expected. The important thing was that I'd risen to the challenge. I'd stood my ground, done the right thing, and seen it through even when it got difficult and scary. And in doing so, I'd helped create positive change that would outlast Patricia's tyranny. That evening, I walked down to the community center for the HOA meeting. The room was packed with residents, all there to participate in the democratic process of governing their community. Susan called the meeting to order, and we went through the agenda efficiently, with real discussion and debate, but none of the toxicity that had characterized Patricia's regime. When we got to the winter maintenance budget, there was a genuine conversation about priorities and resources. Someone suggested using HOA funds to hire a professional snow removal service for the common areas and for elderly residents who couldn't clear their own driveways. "That's a great idea," Susan said. "It's exactly the kind of thing our dues should be paying for, real services that benefit the community." The motion passed unanimously. As the meeting wrapped up, Susan made an announcement. "Before everyone leaves, I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone. Aaron Jenkins could have just ignored Patricia's harassment. He could have kept quiet about the problems with our HOA governance. Instead, he stood up for what was right, even though it put him at personal and professional risk. Because of his courage, we've been able to rebuild our community association into something we can all be proud of. Let's give him a round of applause." The room erupted in applause. I felt my face turn red as everyone turned to look at me. I gave an awkward wave, and Susan mercifully moved on to adjourn the meeting. Afterward, as people filed out, many stopped to shake my hand or pat me on the shoulder. It was touching and embarrassing in equal measure. Mrs. Chen was the last to leave. She took my hand in both of hers and looked up at me with wise, kind eyes. "You did good, Aaron. You stood up to evil and you won. Don't ever forget that sometimes that's what it takes. Good people standing up and saying no." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. That means a lot." She patted my hand and headed out into the cold night. I helped Susan turn off the lights and lock up the community center, and then I walked home under a sky full of stars. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, safe. Lights glowed in windows, showing families gathered together on a cold winter night. This was what community was supposed to be. This was worth fighting for. I thought about everything that had happened over the past year, from that first confrontation on my doorstep to Patricia's arrest to the rebuilding of the HOA. It had been a wild ride, full of stress and conflict and moments of real fear, but it had been worth it. As I unlocked my front door and stepped into my warm house, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because I destroyed an enemy or won some kind of victory, but because I'd helped make my corner of the world a little bit better, a little bit more just, a little bit more like what it should be. And really, what more could anyone ask for? I poured myself that whiskey I'd been thinking about and sat down in my favorite chair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new zoning disputes, new complexities to navigate. But tonight, I was just going to sit here and enjoy the peace. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Jenkins, this is reporter Sarah Morrison from the Gazette. I'm working on a follow-up story about HOA reform in Vermont. Would you be willing to do an interview about your experience and what you think needs to change?" I thought about it for a moment, then texted back, "Yes, happy to help." Because that was the final lesson I'd learned. It wasn't enough to win your own fight. You had to help others win theirs too. You had to share what you'd learned so that other people in other neighborhoods could stand up to their own petty tyrants. The story wasn't over. Patricia's arrest was just one chapter. The real work was the ongoing effort to make sure systems were fair, transparent, and accountable. To make sure that people knew their rights and weren't afraid to exercise them. I was just one person, one zoning director in one small Vermont town. But I'd learned that one person could make a difference. One person standing up could inspire others to do the same. And sometimes all it took was saying no to plowing a driveway at 6:30 in the morning. I raised my glass in a silent toast to that moment, to that decision, to everything that had followed. Then I drank, feeling the warmth spread through me, and I smiled. It had been one hell of a year. But we'd come through it together, stronger and better than before. And that was worth celebrating. Outside, the snow started falling again, soft and gentle, covering the world in white. Inside, I was warm and content, surrounded by the life I'd built in a community I'd helped save. Tomorrow would take care of itself. Tonight, I was exactly where I needed to be, and that was enough.